So right this moment, there are currently over 120,000 people on the transplant list awaiting a transplant that could potentially save their lives. And that is roughly the population of the city of Mobile. As healthcare workers, I'm sure you guys have probably had the opportunity to take care of a transplant patient. But I have found that after working in a transplant center that there are a lot of people in hospital settings that don't necessarily know a lot of informational facts about transplant that I have found that I learned when I was working in a transplant center. So about a year ago, I moved out here from Phoenix, Arizona, where I worked at Mayo Clinic on the transplant team. I worked with the patients to make sure that they completed all of their annual testing that they had to do to remain active on the transplant list, as well as scheduling all their follow-up care, making sure they completed all their appointments in order to remain compliant, and make sure they got all their care taken care of. So I believe that information about organ donation and transplant will help nurses and allied healthcare workers to better take care of their patients and kind of understand some of the hurdles that they've had to accomplish in the past, and then any hurdles that they have coming up in the future. Not many people are aware of the processes of receiving a transplant or being an organ donor, as well as interesting facts that kind of accompany organ transplant or current myths that surround transplant and that people in the public actually take to be truthful. So the criteria for organ transplant and donation is kind of a very long process, and it can be really confusing to the public as well as healthcare workers. It usually begins with a week-long evaluation at a transplant center that covers everything top to bottom health-wise of the patient, as well as they'll also have meetings with social workers to make sure they have caregivers to take care of them after their transplant. They meet with financial planners to make sure that they can afford the transplant. They'll even go to the point of meeting with psychologists to make sure that they can mentally handle receiving a transplant. And once they are cleared by the transplant center, they're placed on the UNOS transplant list. So UNOS has a contract with the United States government, and they are able to determine who actually gets the organ once it becomes available. So there's a lot of criteria that goes into account. It's usually not a first come, first served basis like many people think it is. It has to deal with how well your organ matches with the donor's organ that's available, with geography based on where the organ is in the United States versus where you are, as well as how sick a patient is, so that the sicker a patient is, the higher they up are on the transplant list. So when a patient receives an offer for an organ, they have to immediately report to the transplant center to be prepped for surgery. That being said, a lot of times a patient will go to the transplant center, get prepped for surgery, and get ready to go into the operating room, come to find out the organ that was actually donated wasn't a viable organ, or once they actually visualized the organ, that it wasn't a good match for the patient, so they actually cancel the surgery and send them home. So there are a lot of like dry runs, they say, where the organ actually isn't viable. And actually, to be eligible to be a deceased donor means that the patient has to have suffered a brain death but are still actually alive. So it's either a patient that's been in a motor vehicle accident or had a stroke or something like that that has actually been kept alive for by mechanical means, and they're on a ventilator or something like that. And they have to have 3 consecutive EEGs showing that they actually have no brain activity before they are able to become an organ donor. And regardless of if a patient is registered as an organ donor, it is actually the family's decision if they want to donate the organs or not. So even if I am an organ donor and I don't communicate that to my family, they may not actually be able to use my organs because my family doesn't give consent for that. So getting down to my favorite part, which is the interesting facts about transplants. I learned a lot of interesting things working at Mayo Clinic. One, I never knew that you can donate your liver to someone, and I mean, I always knew, okay, you can donate one of your kidneys, but I never knew that a liver was something that you could donate to someone and still live through. And actually, so if I were to donate my kidney to someone, I would keep 1/3 of my liver, and the other lobe would go to the other person. Within 6 weeks of that transplant, my liver will have regenerated to the size that it originally was, as well as the liver that has been donating to someone else will regenerate to the size that my liver also originally was. So I thought that was very interesting that they both regenerate. The second interesting fact, when I think of someone getting a kidney transplant, I think, okay, so they're going to go in and they're going to take out the kidney and they're going to put the new kidney in exactly where that one would go. And in most cases, they don't actually take out the kidney unless that there's a physical reason for it, such as an infection or something like that, that they would actually have to remove the kidney. And when they do implant the kidney into someone else, they actually put it in their abdomen inside their pelvis so that it makes it easier to access, it's less invasive, and they are able to they're actually able to do biopsies of it easier in the future. Other countries have actually been more progressive in finding organ donors. Singapore is actually offering people up to $36,000 in assistance if they were to donate their organs. Iran has actually done away with their transplant list entirely, and they only pay their citizens to donate their organs. And some countries have actually gone to a system where that if you are not listed as an organ donor and it ever comes to the point where you yourself need an organ transplant, you are not eligible to get an organ transplant for not being listed as an organ donor. The other thing I found that was interesting is actually in 2011 in Sweden, there's a 36-year-old man that had cancer in his trachea, and they actually took stem cells out of his hips, and then they treated them with growth hormone, and they implanted them on a plastic replica of his trachea, and that was then implanted, and it was successful. So that kind of, leads the way for the future of artificial organ transplants. I thought that was really interesting. There are many portrayals in the media that are false, and I found that a lot of people in the public hear these myths and they absolutely believe them. So the first one that I hear a lot of is that wealthy or famous people are automatically placed at the top of the transplant list. Like I said, track everything and they keep all the data and they are the ones who dictate who gets which organ. That being said, wealthy people are able to travel a lot easier than people who may not necessarily be as wealthy, and you can be listed at more than one organ transplant center as long as it is in a separate region. So that being said, as long as you're about 6 hours away, you're able to list yourself at multiple transplant centers. Or in order for it to be successful, you have to do something outside of the region. So I think we are in region 11. So I think the closest one where you'd be able to register here is like up in Tennessee. So, you can list yourself at multiple centers around the country, and that does definitely give you a higher chance of getting an organ faster. So they may think that people automatically get listed faster, but they do have means to speed themselves up on the transplant list. Another myth that is very popular is that doctors will not try as hard to save you if you're listed as an organ donor because they will be making money off of getting your organs. That being said, a lot of people don't even realize that you are an organ donor until they've already done everything that they could possibly do to try and save you. I've heard a lot of news stories saying that there was a woman who woke up in the middle of surgery when they were getting ready to harvest her organs. I'm not saying that's never happened in the past, I just find it hard to believe that that would be something that doctors were willing to do. The third myth that is really prevalent is that there is zero quality standards for organs and that hospitals are willing to implant organs that are diseased or that are damaged. That, like as I stated before, there have been multiple times when I was employed at Mayo Clinic that we had to cancel surgeries because by the time they retrieved an organ and visualized it, that it wasn't viable. That being said, when they take the organ, they do a lot of testing on it to make sure it doesn't have certain diseases and that it is compatible. So they do take every step possible. There have been reports of, I read one report of a patient in 2007 that the CDC reported that he contracted AIDS and hepatitis C from the organ, but there's a 90-day window that if a patient has contracted a disease in that time, that the antibodies won't show up in the tissue yet. So that is kind of a double-edged sword. When the transplant center does call with an offer for an organ, you do have the chance of saying that you don't want it. You know, if they'll say, you know, this is a so-and-so-year-old female that's been known to be homeless and a potential drug user. And you have every right to say that you would like to wait for the next organ that comes available if you don't feel comfortable taking that organ. So, with all the myths that are out there, there are definite pluses and negatives to each of the situations. So it's just going to have to be something that you feel is right for yourself. I hope this information has kind of expanded your guys' knowledge of the transplant policies and procedures, and it will help you deal with your patients in the future. And regardless of if organ donation is something that you believe in or not, I hope you do discuss those feelings with your family members just to make sure that your wishes are carried out for when that day may come. So, thank you guys very much. I appreciate your time. Thank you. You hit my button.